Johnny Depp, The Fall Before the Storm. Johnny Depp's story has always felt like a brilliantly lit stage where shadows move just as intensely as the spotlight itself. For decades, he was Hollywood's enigmatic treasure, the man who transformed every role into something haunting, magnetic, and unforgettable. Yet behind the eccentric charm, behind the trademark smirk, and behind the characters that became cultural giants, a much darker narrative waited to surface. And when it finally did, it wasn't the plot of a new film. It was real. Raw. Painful. And unavoidably public. As we begin this documentary, we step into the early fault lines of Johnny Depp's personal collapse, a collapse shaped by love, fame, addiction, and the brutal machinery of celebrity culture. Before courtroom cameras framed his every word, before global debates split social media, and before the world turned Johnny Depp's private life into an entertainment spectacle, there were signs. Signs that the world ignored. Signs that he ignored. So let us rewind, not to sensationalize, but to understand. Because understanding is the first step to answering a question we all must ask: how does a global icon reach a point where his personal life becomes more famous than his career? The seeds of the storm began years earlier. In Hollywood, fame amplifies everything. Love becomes obsession, conflict becomes warfare, and mistakes become headlines. Johnny Depp had always carried an aura of rebellion. That rebellious spirit is what made him captivating, but it is also the very thing that made him vulnerable. His relationships were intense, passionate, and often volatile. His career required emotional immersion, transforming into capricious pirates, tormented men, strange dreamers, lonely outsiders. But what happens when an actor who vanishes into roles finally faces a role he cannot escape, himself? The first cracks appeared quietly. Financial stress, long-term drinking, mounting pressure from studios, and the emotional burden of a marriage spiraling downward. Hollywood thrives on conflict. After all, conflict sells, but at what point does a personal struggle stop being a private matter and become a global fixation? And does the world ever consider the human underneath the scandal? As Depp's relationship with Amber Heard transformed from passion to destruction, whispers circulated through tabloids and entertainment networks. Every argument became a headline. Every photograph sparked speculation. Every gesture was dissected. People chose sides long before the truth was even known. This was not justice. This was spectacle. And Depp, once adored for disappearing into his characters, suddenly found that everyone believed they had the right to define his character for him. Yet the downfall did not begin with the courtroom. It began with the unraveling of identity. Depp had always used his characters as shields: Jack Sparrow's charm, Edward Scissorhands' innocence, Sweeney Todd's rage. But now, there was nowhere to hide. The world was not asking for Captain Jack. It was asking for Johnny. The real Johnny. And what did the real Johnny have left to show? A man struggling with addiction. A man losing trust in the people around him. A man whose finances were collapsing. A man whose marriage had turned into a battlefield. A man who had given decades to the art of storytelling, only to become trapped in a story he never wanted to tell. Can a person still stand when the world is pulling them apart from every direction? Can fame be both a blessing and a slow-moving curse? Can love, in its most destructive form, ruin even the strongest of spirits? As Depp's life spiraled further, he faced not only accusations but also an inner collapse. And the world watched. Not with empathy, but with hunger. The hunger for drama. The hunger for scandal. The hunger to witness a fall. They forget, of course, that falls hurt. But a fall from global fame? It shatters. By the time the relationship officially ended, the damage was done. His reputation was bruised, his credibility questioned, and his personal demons magnified. Hollywood, always eager to distance itself from controversy, stepped back. Projects paused. Contracts dissolved. The industry that once celebrated him now treated him like a liability. But here lies the question we must ask ourselves: when did we decide that allegations alone were enough to destroy a man? And what does it say about society that we rush to judgment faster than we attempt to understand? This period, before the courtroom battles, before the viral moments, before social media became a battleground, was the darkest chapter of Johnny Depp's life. It was the silent collapse. The hidden suffering. The part of the story no one cared to examine because it lacked the drama that headlines crave. But it was real. It was human. And it mattered. Whether one believes Depp, Heard, or neither, one fact is undeniable: Johnny Depp's personal collapse did not begin with a lawsuit. It began with emotional erosion. With the fragility of a man who had spent years trying to hold everything together: his career, his relationships, his finances, his identity, while the foundation beneath him quietly cracked. And perhaps this is where we ask the most important question of all: is the downfall of a celebrity a reflection of their choices, or a reflection of a society that preys on vulnerability? As we close part 1, we stand at the edge of chaos. Depp has fallen, but he has not yet fought. The courtroom battles are still ahead. The public divides are still forming. The controversy has not reached its peak. This is only the beginning. But before we move forward, let us pause and consider: if the world knew the private pain behind the public headlines, would it have judged him the same way? Or is judgment simply easier than empathy? The courtroom becomes a stage. The courtroom doors opened, and with them, the world stepped into one of the most public and polarizing legal battles of the decade. Johnny Depp versus Amber Heard was no longer a personal dispute. It had transformed into a cultural battleground where justice, reputation, truth, and spectacle collided. Part 2 of this story is not merely about legal documents or witness testimonies. It is about how a courtroom became a theater, how millions became the audience, and how every second of this trial reshaped the narrative around Johnny Depp's fall and potential redemption. As cameras were positioned, microphones tested, and social media feeds armed themselves for constant updates, an unavoidable reality took shape. This was no ordinary case. This was a global obsession. But before the world turned the trial into entertainment, it was a deeply emotional fight for a man who felt stripped of dignity and identity. For Depp, the lawsuit wasn't just about money or reputation, it was about reclaiming his name, something he believed had been unjustly stolen. But here lies the deeper question: how does a man prove his innocence when the world has already chosen sides? The moment Johnny Depp entered the courtroom, his posture told a story, a mix of exhaustion, defiance, and vulnerability. He appeared calm, but beneath that calmness was a storm: years of allegations, career losses, public shaming, and internal collapse. On the other side sat Amber Heard, equally poised, equally prepared, equally determined. The tension in that room was more than legal, it was psychological, emotional, and cultural. Everyone wanted truth. But whose truth? And at what cost? The early testimony revealed the depth of dysfunction in their relationship: recordings of arguments, text messages dripping with anger, stories of addiction, jealousy, and emotional chaos. But this wasn't a simple case of right versus wrong. It was a collision of two deeply damaged people. And the world was watching every second of it. The courtroom became a stage, but the stage did not lie, it exposed. It exposed moments of cruelty. It exposed vulnerability. It exposed the painful dynamics of a love story that became a war zone. As Depp began speaking, the world heard something it had never fully heard before, his voice trembling not as a character, but as himself. He recounted childhood trauma, long-term struggles with substance use, and the emotional turmoil of the relationship. Suddenly, the man known for embodying fantastical roles appeared painfully human. But the courtroom was not a place for sympathy, it was a place for evidence. And evidence came like waves. Photographs, videos, audio recordings, witnesses, experts, each piece pulling the audience deeper into the story. Social media turned the trial into a phenomenon. TikTok recreated scenes with dramatic flair. Live streams gathered millions of viewers. Memes appeared faster than actual news reports. But again, we must ask, was the world seeking justice, or simply entertainment? The truth became secondary to the spectacle. Supporters created factions, #Justice for Johnny and #Justice for Amber, turning real human suffering into online warfare. Every facial expression, every sigh, every glance across the courtroom was analyzed, mocked, praised, or twisted. And as the internet amplified the trial, a dangerous transformation happened: public perception began influencing public narrative. But can justice truly survive in a world where opinion spreads faster than fact? Depp's legal team crafted a narrative of a man wrongfully accused, a man pushed to the edge by false allegations, a man whose career and life were destroyed by a single Washington Post op-ed. Heard's team argued the opposite, that she was a survivor, a woman punished for speaking out, a victim re-traumatized by the public. Two conflicting truths. Two fractured perspectives. One courtroom. One world watching. And one question echoing at the center: what really happened behind closed doors? As the trial continued, the testimonies grew heavier. Depp described moments he felt powerless, moments he tried to walk away, moments he claimed he was the one being hurt. Heard described terror, chaos, and a relationship where she felt trapped. In this battle of narratives, the courtroom felt less like a place of truth and more like a battlefield of storytelling. But unlike film scripts, these stories had real consequences. Depp's reputation. Heard's future. Their careers. Their emotional well-being. Their legacies. At one point, the trial revealed secret recordings, raw, unfiltered windows into their arguments. Voices filled with rage, despair, sarcasm, and pain echoed across the courtroom speakers. The world leaned closer, fascinated. But should anyone have listened to these private moments? Should the public have consumed their suffering like entertainment? These questions lingered like shadows over the trial. As each day passed, Depp's testimony began shifting public opinion. His vulnerability, his sadness, his detailed recounting of events, all of it painted him as a man deeply wounded by allegations he claimed were false. Meanwhile, Heard's testimony triggered intense reactions: support from some, doubt from others, hostility from many. Online narratives became harsher, more personal, more dangerous. It no longer felt like a legal case, it felt like a global referendum on gender, power, fame, and credibility. And as we watched this unfold, we must ask, did the public truly care about truth, or did it simply choose the story that entertained them most? Meanwhile, Hollywood observed from the sidelines. Studio executives watched the trial with calculating eyes. Depp had already lost films Fantastic Beasts, Pirates of the Caribbean, but the trial now offered a twisted possibility: could he reclaim his career if he won? And if he lost, would this be the final chapter of Johnny Depp's Hollywood legacy? By the midpoint of the trial, something remarkable happened. The world began shifting, from skepticism to belief, from doubt to empathy, from condemnation to support. Depp, once written off as a fallen star, began regaining something he had long lost: the public's trust. But is public trust enough to rebuild a life shattered by scandal? Or is it merely another illusion created by the same media machine that destroyed him? As Part 2 closes, we leave the courtroom mid-storm. Testimonies have collided. Evidence has overwhelmed. The world has chosen sides. And Johnny Depp stands in the center, fighting not only for legal victory but for something far more personal: his right to exist without being defined by allegations. In Part 3, we move into the decisive phase, the turning points, the explosive moments, the cultural impact, and the shocking shift that would redefine everything. The verdict, the collapse, and the rebirth. As the trial neared its final days, the courtroom seemed to thicken with a tension so heavy it felt almost physical. The world, once merely curious, was now consumed. Every testimony, every objection, every raised eyebrow became part of a global narrative spiraling far beyond the courthouse walls. Johnny Depp, who once stood as a symbol of Hollywood eccentricity and artistic brilliance, now sat at the center of a cultural moment unlike anything the entertainment industry had seen in years. But Part 3 of this story is about more than the verdict: it's about the unraveling and the rebuilding that followed. It's about a man who had fallen so far that the only direction left was up. It's about whether redemption is a right, a privilege, or something earned through suffering. But most importantly, it's about the question that defined this entire spectacle: what does justice look like when the entire world is watching? When closing arguments began, the courtroom transformed from a battleground of evidence into a battlefield of persuasion. Depp's team painted a portrait of a man wronged, a career destroyed, a reputation unfairly shattered. They argued that the allegations had inflicted more damage than any physical wound ever could. Heard's team countered with claims of systemic disbelief, gendered scrutiny, and the harsh consequences women face when speaking out. Two narratives. Two realities. Yet only one decision would stand. Outside the courthouse, supporters camped out for hours just to watch Depp wave or smile. Inside, the man who had once commanded global fame now sat silently, listening as lawyers debated the darkest moments of his life. And here's a thought that struck millions watching the livestream: how does a man endure having his trauma dissected in front of the entire planet? This trial was no longer simply about defamation, it had become a referendum on identity, masculinity, victimhood, credibility, and the fragility of public trust. When the jury disappeared to deliberate, the internet buzzed with predictions. Legal analysts debated endlessly. Fans argued passionately. Meme culture thrived. But behind all that noise, one man sat in silence, waiting to hear whether the world believed him. When the verdict was finally read, the courtroom held its breath. The jury found that Amber Heard's statements about domestic abuse were defamatory. Johnny Depp had won. He didn't simply win legally, he won socially, culturally, symbolically. The courtroom erupted in emotion, some crying, some stunned, some cheering softly. Depp was not present for the verdict, but the roar of the public reaction might as well have echoed across oceans. In that moment, a man once considered finished had climbed out of the ashes of his own downfall. But here's the question no one can avoid: what does victory mean when the fight itself has already scarred you beyond recognition? Even with the verdict in his favor, Depp's journey was far from simple. Winning in court did not erase years of pain. It did not magically restore lost roles, lost friendships, or the emotional wounds of a collapsed marriage. It did not heal the years spent battling addiction, grief, and public humiliation. Nor did it erase the darker truths revealed during the trial: the volatility, the destructive patterns, the emotional chaos that consumed both him and Heard. And so the story shifts, from battle to aftermath. The internet celebrated him as a symbol of perseverance. But beneath the celebration, Depp seemed quieter, more introspective, almost uncertain of what this victory truly meant. He released a statement thanking the jury and saying he felt he finally had his life back. But what kind of life was left to reclaim? A career? Yes, perhaps. A reputation? Slowly. A sense of peace? That would take far longer. Yet something remarkable happened next. Hollywood opened its doors again. Studios that had once severed ties began expressing interest. Directors spoke of his talent with renewed admiration. Dior renewed his contract, the longest-running ambassador deal in the brand's history. Audiences, who had grown up with Jack Sparrow and Edward Scissorhands, embraced him once more. But is public approval a form of redemption, or just another fleeting wave of attention waiting to crash again? Johnny Depp, now free from the shadows of the trial, stepped toward a different kind of life. He began touring with his band, painting artworks, reconnecting with friends, and focusing on quieter, more personal projects. He appeared not as the eccentric Hollywood legend he once was, but as a man who had finally survived the storm. His eyes, once chaotic with energy, now carried something softer: exhaustion, yes, but also clarity. He no longer seemed interested in reclaiming the throne of global superstardom. Instead, he seemed to want something far simpler: a chance to exist on his own terms. But the darker side of the story cannot be ignored. Amber Heard became the target of unprecedented online hostility, some justified, much of it not. The trial's aftermath created an internet battlefield that raised important questions: had justice prevailed, or had the line between justice and entertainment blurred beyond recognition? Did the public truly believe in truth, or did it simply embrace the narrative that felt more satisfying? For Depp, however, the verdict marked a turning point: a slow, steady journey out of personal collapse and toward reinvention. Not the reinvention of a movie star, but the reinvention of a man who had spent years drowning in controversy. And perhaps that is the most powerful aspect of his story, that redemption, real redemption, does not come from a jury, it comes from rebuilding oneself piece by fragile piece. As we close this final part, one lingering question remains. What does freedom mean to a man who has lived most of his life under the weight of fame, scrutiny, addiction, and heartbreak? Maybe the answer lies in his silence, in the way he now moves through life with less urgency, less chaos, less desire to please the world. Maybe the trial did not save him. maybe it simply revealed him. And maybe that revelation, painful as it was, became the first true step toward healing. This is the end of the courtroom chapter, but not the end of Johnny Depp's story. Not the end of his battles. Not the end of his evolution. Just the beginning of a quieter, truer life. If he chooses it. Johnny Depp's journey reminds us that even in the darkest moments, the truth has a way of resurfacing. His story is not just about a courtroom victory, it's about resilience, reclaiming identity, and finding the strength to rebuild when the world has already counted you out. Thank you for watching this deep dive into a story that changed Hollywood, the internet, and public perception forever. If you enjoyed this documentary-style breakdown, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss another episode. Your support helps us bring more powerful stories to life. See you in the next video.